Okay, hey everybody, welcome to another episode of On the Rest from Off the Cuff. Today we have a really cool watch review for you from a relatively new watch brand called Alexander James Watches. Now, all these watches are actually hand assembled in Chicago, Illinois, which is very, very cool. Essentially, Alexander started out doing Seiko mods and wanted to bring something original of his own to the market. And I think that's kind of a pretty common point of progression. You like to kind of customize what's already out there, and eventually you're like, hey, well, maybe if I started from scratch, what would it look like? What would it look like? What did it feel like? What market would it fill? So, of course, this particular type of watch is a dive watch. Some key common characteristics and design language. When you're looking for a dive watch, you're normally going to want, of course, some type of water resistance through a screw down crown. You're going to want something that's tough, legible with a dive time bezel, and if it's on bracelet, a diver's extension is always welcome. This particular model is the NDR001 White Snowflake, or the Snowflake Diver. Now, this is pretty much Alexander James' first large production run watch. The white dial was, of course, inspired by various Seiko Snowflake-style dials. I would say most notably this is more comparable to the more frosted dials of, like, let's say, a SARX055. So it's not going to have that super deep grain. It's going to be more of that kind of washy paper, finish where there's a nice fine fibers, as well as, it does look like a certain level of frost, like on a window pane or something like that. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a closer look. Okay. So as you can see, the dial is the real highlight of this piece. This dial is absolutely magnetic. This actually, a little bit about the pricing. This retails for about $350, so $349.99 direct from Alexander James. And look at that dial, just the way it plays with the light and just captures so many different textures and hues. Really, really a huge fan. Now, to get into some of the other details, of course, this is actually a 40 millimeter diameter with a 14.3 millimeter height and a 48 millimeter lug to lug. This is, of course, 316L stainless steel, and everything is pretty nicely brushed with a finely polished bevel, as you can see there. So really nice touch and detail there, and something you definitely like to see. This is definitely, as far as the case goes, quite meaty. I think it's almost a bit meatier than it needs to be. As far as that profile, that slab side is a bit reminiscent of the Black Bay, of course, with a little bit more of an angular setup, but of course the big crown with the extended kind of collar there, it definitely does have a bit of that vibe to it, but I think it definitely, the proportions also kind of make it fit within that space. But I think everything is spaced very nicely, and to me aesthetically it doesn't really look too much like a Black Bay, although it does have a similar silhouette when you're not paying attention to the details. Now, as far as this crystal goes, as you can see, it's actually double domed, so quite legible. So domed on the top and domed underneath. It's a very mild dome, but I think that suits the watch. And then, as you can see, even at these super harsh viewing angles, still quite legible. So really nice from that standpoint. Now, the bezel action is actually 120 clicks. Very nice. I mean, even with the gloves on, the tactile feeling there is really, really nice. And it lines up quite nicely, as you can see there, right at the 12 o'clock as far as the pip goes. Now, of course, the AR coating does help manage the reflections, even in the harsh studio lights here, where you can see it's doing everything it can to kind of negotiate those reflections. You can see once it's out of the direct reflection, it actually looks quite good. Now, the crown is nicely signed, and also, of course, a screw-down crown, because this is a dive watch. Now that dial has that beautiful frosted texture. It does also have applied indices, which is a nice touch. It has polished hands, and the lume is BGW9, so it's going to have that nice blue glow, and then during the daylight it's actually going to appear quite white, which is nice. The water resistance on this one is 200 meters, which I think is perfectly acceptable for a dive watch. With the thickness, I almost would have hoped for a little bit more, and so I feel like maybe if they can thin this out, keep it 200 meters, I think that'd be really great. Everything is quite solid from the end links and links and everything. They're of course screw in. The one kind of stamped feature here would be the clasp. So it is stamped, so that's a little bit of a disappointment. But honestly, these are actually quite easy to swap out if if you really just had to have a milled clasp. There's definitely other options that are out there, because this does have a very nice 20 millimeter taper down to 18. So really any 18 millimeter clasp milled you could put on there if you really wanted to. But I think it helps, as far as the way it wears, it's actually quite sleek with the thinner clasp on the bracelet, which is nice. Now, of course, it is double locking, has stamp, but it does also have micro adjustments, so you can really nail that in as far as when you do have it on wrists. So with that said, let's actually get this piece on wrist. Okay, as you can see on my 7 1/4 inch wrist, I put a little bit more arm in there so you get a little bit of better idea of the scale. Works really nicely, and I think because of that more expansive dial, it is going to wear a little bit bigger than you would expect for a 40 millimeter dive watch. Of course, it does have quite wide lugs, although they are, nicely adorned there with that beautiful, look at that high definition bevel. Really, really handsome. Great choice, and definitely on trend with what you're seeing from micro brands these days as far as the finishing levels, just all increasing across the board. Looks really good. And then if you actually get some looks at angle, you could see it does, it is a dive watch. It has a pretty tall crown, pretty thick kind of side slab case. So although it's only 14.3 millimeters thick, which isn't terribly thick, there's definitely dive watches that are much thicker. The way that, excuse me, the way that it wears that thickness is definitely something that's going to stand out. So it does have that really nice tool aesthetic to it, although it does have, that kind of the snowflake also, kind of looked playing as well. So this definitely feels like a bit like an overbuilt diver, nice and chunky, nice and strong, very capable. So it's not chunky to the point of where I'd say it's oversized by any means, but it definitely, that the size and the heft of it do give it that overbuilt feel, which a lot of people are looking for, and a lot of people kind of read that as quality, whether it's going to be the visual weight that's carried by this beautiful dial and bezel combination. Of course, we do have that fully loomed ceramic bezel there. Nicely, nice glossy finish to it, which I think ties in really, really well, and also helps negotiate some of those, some of those reflections and everything. Kind of, it really has a way of lighting up and catching the light, which I really, really enjoy. So with that said, let's actually move into some low light transition. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights. So as you can see, that BGW9 is just booming. Really beautiful glow there. Even if I hit it with a little bit of black light there, you can see this thing at really full mass. Quite handsome. You can see even some of the light reflecting back off of those hands, and the indices and everything really do help play off of the dial. But one thing I really like to do when I'm getting into lume shots is do a bit of a low light transition, because you're not always going to be indoors, outdoors, out in the middle of a field in direct sunlight. The majority of the time you're going to be indoors transitioning, from a well-lit area to some place that's not as optimally lit. So I do like to give you guys a chance to kind of see how the way different colors, of course, are going to play in different lighting situations, and it also does a great job of highlighting some of those textures and that finishing, because these hot studio lights, although they do a good job of simulating direct sunlight, they do tend to wash out some of the imperfections and the details. You can see as the light kind of goes over the brushing on the bracelet. I mean, this isn't some super high level, you know, luxury type finish or anything like that, but definitely it has a nice brushed finish, almost into a kind of hand brushed appeal to it, which I think as far as, you know, playing into that kind of wabi sabi of the piece is actually a nice touch, and I think it does tie in really nicely with the dial itself. And I mean, just the color transitions on this, I love that BGW9 playing off of this dial. Absolutely gorgeous. So let's go ahead and get into some closing thoughts. Now, on the wrist, it has really nice proportions. Of course, it does wear a bit larger due to kind of that 41 millimeter coin edge bezel. So although the case is 40 millimeters, the bezel itself is actually closer to 41. So, you know, it on the wrist, it really feels almost like a pre-made Seiko mod. And I think that's, of course, the roots of this watch. You know, the bezel actually reminds me of a Mako coin edge bezel, an aftermarket upgrade from Yaboki's. So it definitely does have a bit of that kind of pre-assembled mod vibe to it, but I mean, that's a popular niche these days. I mean, think about Undone and how many watches they're selling. So I think this is a really cool one, and of course, if I could probably piece one together, I really can't say that it would be too different than what's here already. So I mean, I think it is really a kind of a nice canvas to build off of, and I think it's really well put together and well spec'd together. Now, as far as the model variants go, there's also a textured black dial. Of course, you're gonna lose kind of the that snowflake appeal there, but I think it's still quite handsome as well. It definitely is going to be a little bit more vanilla, and I'd say standing out a little bit less when compared to the rest of the pack. But when it comes to the snowflake dial, I think it definitely adds a huge step of uniqueness, which I can definitely appreciate. Now, as far as comparable models go, I mean, as far as specs wise, you know, this is starting to become pretty standard in the microbrand space. But you know, that snowflake dial is really what sets us apart. And it does add a lot to that formula. You know, this is a solid watch. You know, it's the whole story of, you know, modern technology and everything catching up. I mean, look at the beautiful bevels. So you're able to get a pretty nice watch. I mean, from, yeah, somebody who used to really just be into modding Seikos. And I think that's really great, because when you're an enthusiast-based company, it's really, I feel like it's really easy for you to connect with your market, because you're part of that market still. You're part of that demographic. It's not like this was, you know, Alexander James was started by, you know, a couple of entrepreneurs who saw a space or an opportunity to make a profit. This is a brand that's started by a watch enthusiast, a guy who likes watches, who, you know, so, and of course you build a watch that you enjoy, and you hope that other people can enjoy it as well. And I think in this case, he definitely built a winner here. Now, you know, really the bottom line is this is really clean enough to be super versatile and wearable, you know, in pretty much any situation. But I think it's definitely unique enough to still stand out from the rest of the pack, which, let's be honest, guys, you know, although this is a great price at $350, I mean, kind of that under 500 market right now for you know, independent divers is pretty saturated, but I can safely say that this is going to be one of the coolest snowflake dials you're going to see at this price point. So you know, you can take it with, that with what you will. Definitely leave me some comments, let me know what you think. If you like the video, please do it like. If you're not, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.